Hey guys, Chris here. Tonight I have a story about two young men who go grouse hunting along Minnesota's north shore of Lake Superior, and there they have an encounter with something extremely frightening that does not want them there. That's next. Okay guys, so tonight I am along the Carson River just outside of Carson City. We still got a little bit of fall color here, and it's going to get dark really quick on me. That's okay, I got plenty of good lighting. I know the route out. Cars that way, a little ways tonight, but it's all good. And for tonight's beer, we have, it's called Bell's Two-Hearted Ale, and that has a trout on it. And that is an American IPA. So, oh, it always gets shaken up in my backpack, which, like I say, I'm kind of a mess. There we go. Oh yeah. Ooh. Give you a critique of this. Ooh, that is kind of bitter, but frothy and tasty though. It's got a really good aftertaste. So our story takes place in northern Minnesota along Lake Superior's north shore, and the north shore is where Lake Superior kind of tapers down like this, and then from this point on up is the northeast boundary of Minnesota. And then if you go to the south of there, that's the South Shore or Wisconsin. And so if you go from Duluth on up, you're along the north shore of Minnesota. And it's great country. I used to camp up there growing up, made trips up there to go fishing along the rivers that come down into Lake Superior. Great country, just beautiful country up there. So up near the small town of Silver Bay, Minnesota, small town on the north shore in Lake County, two young men, Kevin and Danny, were returning from grouse hunting deep in the forest east of Silver Bay. And they were both 17 years old, 1988, both experienced woodsmen, outdoorsmen, and hunters. They knew their stuff, they were really good. They were off trail in an area that had some lakes and some marshy areas, apparently really good grouse hunting. And they were coming through the brush, working their way back to the trail. And it was getting dark, kind of like this. I mean, it's getting dark really quick here. We still got some sun reflecting in the clouds you can see over to the west here in front of me. But it was getting dark fast on them. And they heard, as they're going through the brush, this loud howl about 200 yards away. Had a deep bass to it. And Kevin said it felt like it was directed at them. It was kind of an angry howl, and it went from like a low to a high and then back down a little bit. 8 to 10 seconds, and really deep bass to it, and then a kind of a high pitch to it. It's kind of a... Immediately, they were intimidated. That was the word they used, is intimidated. And they're hunters, and so they got their 12-gauge shotguns. So when they first heard this howl, Kevin looked at Danny and he didn't say a word, and then Danny just said, "Yes, I heard it." Their car was a long ways off still. It was getting dark, really thick brush, and they're working their way towards the trail, but this sound was directly on their route to the trail, and they didn't want to go a way around because they knew there was other lakes and swamps in either direction, and at that time of night they could get lost. They knew they just needed to go straight, so they cautiously moved forward through this thick brush. They had their shotguns, so they were glad that they had something. They weren't going to just start shooting into the forest. And then they heard it again, this howl, just low to high, back down to low. 7, 8, 9 seconds. And they're working their way through the brush. They finally get to the trail, take a right, some relief because they're heading back towards the vehicle and towards Silver Bay, heading east. Kevin checked his compass and you could see, yeah, we're definitely going east. This is the trail. You know, when you get in the forest, even when you're on the trail, things start looking the same. And so you gotta double check, because you don't want to be, wait, this is the trail, and if you go the wrong direction, you know, it can be detrimental to your life, right? And while walking along this trail heading east towards the lake, Lake Superior, they heard in the forest some movement. Not a loud crashing, not things breaking, just something walking. And it was walking kind of with them. A little bit behind them, but paralleling them. And now they were really concerned, because this thing wasn't just a sound that was a couple hundred yards away and a howl. Something was following them. And Danny mentioned later that it felt almost like whatever this thing was almost like escorting them out. It had this loud howl, made its presence known, and now it was just going to make sure that they left the area. And they were happy to oblige in leaving, especially with the sun going down and not knowing really what was going on. So this went on for over 200 yards, and they could hear this thing walking in the thick forest, maybe 40, 50 yards off to their right as they're heading on this trail. And I had a similar story about the Pacific Creek Valley in the Sierra Nevada, very similar type of situation. But this thing was just quietly walking with them, and at one point they stopped, and then like a half a second later it stopped. So it was almost like it was trying to be concealed and not to be seen, but it wanted to stay with them as well. Really crazy. And the sound that they heard was like nothing they'd ever heard. It wasn't a moose, it wasn't a bear, a lion, a timber wolf. There's timber wolves in northern Minnesota. It was none of those. And so they knew they needed to just keep going and get out of there. And so they continued going down the trail. And they heard this kind of a loud crashing sound, like whatever it was now it shook a tree or something. It did something kind of dramatic in the forest, and they both dropped to one knee with their shotguns, kind of scanning the tree line to see if there was anything going to come out of the brush towards them. So they were ready with their shotguns, and their hearts are just beating, and seriously. And then it was quiet again, and they both looked at each other and just let's just get out of here. And at that point, they had these 3 grouse that they had shot earlier, and they just dropped them. They left them there. They didn't want to deal with it and carry that, so they had their hands on the guns, moving east on this trail. And as they're walking along this trail, they continued to hear these footsteps again in the forest, just to their right, and they knew they had to stay the course. And then they came to this area where there was a marsh, really marshy, small pond, and they were still in the forest, but it was almost like a clearing at this point. And so the forest that was off to the right now was open. And so whatever was in the forest is either going to turn and leave or stop as they continue, or it's going to continue and parallel them. And this was the scariest part of the whole thing. They got to this clearing. They weren't in the clearing. They were still in the woods, but to their right, it was very clear where this marshy area was. And they knew that if they walked out there, they would be at least a foot or so in like a muck of dirt, mud, water, and vegetation, just really a marsh. And then they saw it. They saw this creature step out of the forest as they were continuing to walk. And all they saw was a silhouette, because it was backlit, because it was open in this area, and there was still some sun, kind of like I have behind me here. You can see the skyline. And so they saw this silhouette, and it was still paralleling them as they were continuing down the trail. And they didn't want to run. They had their shotguns, and they knew where they were going. They just needed to keep going. And this silhouette was out there, and it was effortlessly moving through this swamp on 2 feet, broad shoulders, just a dark shape, conical shaped, kind of a pointed shaped head, and no neck. Really long arms, and they could see these arms kind of swaying back and forth as it almost glided through this marsh, just effortlessly. Not really swift, but really smooth and efficient, just working its way. And they're like, holy shit, this is not a bear. This is absolutely not a bear. And they continued to go, and then they saw it disappear back into the next set of woods as they continued, and it continued with them. And then finally it came to a point where it dropped down like a little ravine, and then up this small ridge, and then they dropped down the other side of this ridge, and they could hear this thing kind of turning and getting quiet, and then it was just quiet. And they kept going, and now they were like, since this thing was no longer pursuing them, at least they thought, as far as they could hear. And at this point, they're carrying their shotguns, and they were moving a lot quicker now, because they were not trying to be as cautious about whatever this thing was doing, and they didn't want to run and trigger it or whatever. And now they had this kind of a trot going, and so they got their flashlights out, and they're shining them on the trail. Now it's pitch black, like it's going to be for me in about 3 minutes here. And they're carrying their shotguns, and they're heading out of the forest, relieved that they got like maybe a half mile to go to get back to the car. And they knew their route. Again, they knew their route. And it's really important when you go in. One of the things I always do, if I'm unfamiliar with an area, I always stop and I look behind me at the landscape behind me, because that's where I'm going to be. My view is going to be on my way out, looking that way now. And so it helps me to remember, look for landmarks. And the mountains are really helpful for that, because if you see a prominent peak or a meadow or some trees, you can remember that if you stop and look behind you. And so they knew exactly where they were going. They got back to the vehicle, unloaded their shotguns, took a deep breath, and said, "What the hell was that? Oh my God." And they got out of there All right, there's some geese flying over me. Nice. So Danny was asked later about the encounter, and they asked him, "Do you believe in Sasquatch?" And he said, all he said was, "I know what I saw, I know it's real, and I don't care what you think." And he also added, he said, "I'm a competent outdoorsman," and years later he was a wilderness guide as well. And he said he'd never experienced anything like that. And that day in northern Minnesota, this animal, how it dealt with them and how it put fear in them, made him feel like he was in kindergarten. And that is our story for tonight. What a beautiful fall night I got here. Got this purple sky behind me. Got some geese that went down the river. I got almost a full moon over my left shoulder here. Not here, but over that way. That is awesome. Wow. And I can see a star like right north of it. I think that's Mars. It's kind of a bright one. Or Venus. Maybe it's Venus. Somebody will let me know what that is. So I have a little bit of a hike out, so I better pack up. But yeah, I got more stories coming, you guys. This is a lot of fun. Winter is coming, as they say on Game of Thrones, and so I'm going to deal with that, because I can't sit out here when it's snowing out and 7 degrees or something. I can't do that. But I do have a hot tent. I have a pop-up camper. I have other options, and I'm looking forward to that. That'll be kind of fun. That'll be nice to have a shelter, so to speak. So, all right, you guys, if you like stories about the strange, unexplained, and things that go bump in the night, please like and subscribe, comment. You guys always know what to do. So, all right, thanks again. We'll see you next time. Keep hiking.